Greetings, everybody. My name is Timur. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be speaking about migrating to the exabyte.io platform and digital collaboration and how we enable it on the platform. Before we start, I want to go over a couple of important details. The goal of this webinar is to help users to understand what exabyte.io platform is and how to benefit from using it. This is the second webinar in the monthly series. First Friday of the month, we speak about getting started. Every third Friday of the month, we speak about advanced topics. And this is what we are doing today. Every participant should be a registered platform user, and every participant will receive this presentation in a PDF format, so there is no need to take notes. This webinar is also recorded and will be made available online on our YouTube channel. At any point, if you have questions, we welcome you asking these questions using either Q&A or the chat functionality of Zoom. We'll have specific time slots to answer those questions in the middle and at the end of our conversation. We will assume today that the user, the webinar attendee, is an experienced computational material scientist, familiar with tools like Quantum Espresso, VASP, or similar. We will assume that the users understand the basics of Linux and Unix operating system, has an established set of scripts and input files to perform calculations, and would like to know how to migrate these scripts to the exabyte platform and how to work collaboratively within the platform with other users. In terms of migrating to exabyte.io, we'll speak about two basic options. Option number one is to bypass the web interface entirely and use alternative connection options to access the command line environment and reuse existing scripts input files. There are good parts to it and there are not so good parts. The pros are that it's quick to start, it's a familiar command line environment. And the cons are that this approach is error prone and it's difficult to reuse and share this scripts and input files. The second option is to adopt the exabyte.io platform way, our approach, and create materials, workflows, and jobs as the platform entities. This will require new users to learn our approach, and it needs time. However, once you've learned and once you have these entities created, these materials, workflows, and jobs are easily shareable. They're indexed in the database, so it's easier to work with them in the long term. Now, the options for collaboration also follow this too. Essentially, there is a way to bypass the web interface and use alternative connection options to collaborate via the shared file system. So there's a way to put files in a domain where it's accessible to multiple platform users at the same time. And the second option is to embrace the platform entities approach and create entities in the database and then allow role-based permissions on these entities and share them publicly on the web if necessary. And we will speak about both of these options today. So here is the brief agenda for today's conversation. We'll start with the platform infrastructure overview. We'll speak about the alternative connection options, the login node file system, and shared access to data. We then will proceed with a more detailed discussion about the entities, the materials, the workflows, the jobs. And at the end, we'll finish with specific topics about the collaboration. All webinar participants can request access to the webinar account. The webinar account is a shared organizational team account. So you can try the team functionality at no cost. All webinar participants are eligible to use the webinar account. It has advanced features such as command line access and remote desktop access enabled for it. And during the webinar, we will see recorded images of the functionality, recorded videos. And you can follow the presentation at your own pace and repeat what we do during the webinar using this webinar account. Okay, so let's start with the platform infrastructure overview. And here is a quick picture that demonstrates the architecture of the exabyte platform. I know it looks complicated from the first view, but there are a few important components that are facing the user, and those are highlighted in blue in this diagram. So when you log into the platform using a web browser, this is the web interface that you're accessing. And there is a way to further access the login node, so the infrastructure part that is connected to the computational resources directly through two alternative connection methods, through remote desktop or web terminal that enable the connection from the web interface to the login node. There is also a way to connect directly to the login node through a secure shell client, SSH client, and there is a way to communicate directly with a database through the RESTful API. So when we summarize it, today we'll speak about these three connection methods: the secure shell connection, the web-based terminal, and the remote desktop connection. The RESTful API will leave out from today's discussion. The secure shell is a familiar tool to many computational material scientists. So in order to establish the connection to our platform with any secure shell client, we will have to establish the key pairs. We have to create the private key on our computer and upload the public key to the exabyte web interface. And that's a straightforward procedure. It can be done using the preferences tab of the exabyte platform account. Now, to access the web terminal, one would need to open the right-hand sidebar and click on the web terminal there, the terminal icon, and that creates an SSH session within the web browser. So again, it's the same familiar environment, Unix environment, but can be accessed through the web. And the third option, the remote desktop, is equivalently, it can be accessed through the right-hand sidebar. We click on the remote desktop option instead. And here we are connected to a Linux remote desktop. Okay, we can start Linux applications such as 3D analysis tools or even simulation engines. Now, in order to understand how we can share the information, share the data through the file system, we have to understand how the file system actually looks like. And this diagram helps illustrate it. So we connect to the login node when we use one of the alternative connection methods, which in turn is connected to multiple computational systems. So for each computational cluster, we have a master node, which communicates with the compute nodes and manages them. It can remove them or add them based on the current workload. And for each of this master node, we have its replica or its mirror on the login node for the file system. So we have an aggregated file system that contains data, accumulated data from all these three clusters in this picture. So in order to access data which is specific to a certain cluster, we have to navigate to the path that is specific to this cluster on the login node. Now, when we open the home folder for a user on the login node, we will see this links to the cluster. So today on the platform in production, we have cluster 001, cluster 007. And when navigating into one of these subfolder links, we will start using the corresponding file systems. Now, when we navigate into, say, cluster 001, we'll see a further specific subdivision of the file system that includes links to organizational accounts where user is a member. So I am a member of exabyte-io account. That's why I see the corresponding folder here. Then we'll see the data folder where web-based jobs data is organized. So everything that originates on the web goes into this data folder for a personal account. And we also have links to the Dropbox folder, a folder that is shared between multiple parts of the infrastructure, and this templates folder that contains command line job script templates. The Dropbox folder is connected to multiple parts of the infrastructure, as I mentioned, and it serves the purpose similar to what a familiar to many Dropbox application would serve, right? It's a quick cache to share data between multiple parts of the infrastructure. It is available on the web interface. It's available on the login node, on the master node, on the compute node, essentially everywhere where you want it. And it's a convenient way to share small data, things like scripts, for example, Python scripts or Bash scripts, set of potentials, Jupyter Lab notebooks, and things like that. The user data folder on the cluster has a specific naming convention, and it's based on the name of the project and the job and its ID in the database. So for example, when we have user Steven that has a project named default and the job named new job November 11, 2018, with a certain ID, all of this will contribute to the name of the job inside the data project. So it will have this structure, Steven-default, and then a slugified computer-friendly name of the job. For organizational account, the ID is the same, except for instead of having the data stored inside the user home directory, we store it inside the groups directory of the particular account. Now, why it's important to understand the file system and where the data is stored, it's important to understand it because there's certain functionality that we today are yet to support at the web interface level, but we already have a way to visualize, for example, Fermi surfaces implemented through xCrystal, which is an application accessible to remote desktop. And if you know where to get the results of the Fermi surface calculation workflow, you can already visualize the Fermi surface using remote desktop. Okay, so some notes regarding the remote connection. Remote connection is an alternative way to access the Exabyte platform. It can be enabled upon request. There are three options: web terminal, remote desktop in browser, and an SSH connection. The remote sessions are connected to a login node with a separate home folder for each user and a separate organizational home folder for each organization. Home folders have links to directories for compute clusters. One important note here is that command line jobs must be submitted from within a cluster directory. So before starting the calculations, we have to navigate into one of the clusters and then create the command line job directory there and submit the job script from within it. Because that's the way for us to know which cluster to send the command line job into. There is a variety of software packages available both via remote desktop and through the command line interface modules. It's a quick stop for the Q&A, no questions so far, so let's continue on. And let's speak about materials and how we can create materials based on the input data for Quantum Espresso. So here I have a representative Quantum Espresso workflow where I first run a self-consistent field calculation, and then I follow it with a non-self-consistent field calculation, so 2 input files. And I will explain right now how to migrate the material information for these 2 input files to the Exabyte platform, how to create the materials and workflow entities corresponding to these 2 input files. So the first step to create a material is to understand what materials we're dealing with inside the input file. So for Quantum Espresso, we have the material information as part of the input file inside the system and cell parameters, atomic species and atomic positions cards. So here I'm looking at the card and I see that it has certain cell dimension expressed in atomic units and bors. And there are certain cell parameters which constitute tetragonal cell in this case, right? So all angles are 90 degrees. And then I have the C-axis 2.15 times larger than the A and B So that's what I'm noting, and then I'm coming to the user interface, clicking on the plus button to initiate the materials designer session. And inside this materials designer session, I click clone to clone the default material, and then I remove the default material to deal with the new clone. Okay, so I name it according to the formula of this newly soon to be created material, and this initiates the materials designer session for me. The next step is to set the crystal lattice parameters. So if I now enlarge the crystal lattice dialog, I can see that there are certain parameters that I have to set, and I will set them right now based on the data inside the input file. First, I will set the lattice to simple cubic, to triclinic, because I will have to set up all the A, B, and C parameters and angles by hand. And then I'm copying the values and converting them from boards to angstroms. So A and B are equal to 533, and C is equal to 11.5. And then I'm putting all the angles to 90 degrees. And then at the end, I'm applying the edits. And now I see that the lattice changes from FCC for the default silicon to the one corresponding to my input files. Okay, so that is how we set up the crystal lattice for this newly designed material. The second step is to set up the crystal bases. And for that, I'm opening the crystal bases dialog and just copying and pasting the atomic positions card. The atomic positions are already in crystal coordinates, which corresponds to what I have here. I have crystal units enabled. So all I need to do is just to copy and paste the coordinates here. Okay. Now we see that the material started to take its shape. You see additional marking here. These are atomic constraints. So one means there is no constraint. So no constraints are present right now on any of the atomic movements for this structure. The last part here is to save this material. For that, we need to open the corresponding, menu item on the left. So we click on the input output menu and then click on save. And we can tag this material. I'm adding the from pw.x tag. And you can see that there's a spinner in the top right corner, indicating that the system is working on saving this material. After a little while, the operation is successful. So if I come back to my list of materials, if I exit this materials designer session, now I can see that this newly created material is available for my account. And it has the from pw.x tag. Okay. Now the second option is to convert the pw.x input to POSCAR and upload it using the upload functionality. The upload functionality we discussed 2 weeks ago in the getting started webinar, so I will not cover it here. You can refer to the corresponding video. But essentially what we have to do is we can use some of the tools online or the converters that are available otherwise, and take the input for Quantum Espresso and convert it to POSCAR, which is what I'm doing here. And then I can use this POSCAR to feed it directly to the upload function in our platform. Okay, so these are the two ways for converting the Quantum Espresso materials information from Quantum Espresso info file to an exabyte platform entity. Now, we will proceed to migrate the information, the logic inside the simulation workflow that I'm deploying here. The logic is relatively straightforward. For this particular calculation, I have 2 units, SCF and NSCF units. And I will now create a workflow that will contain those 2 units for the specific parameters migrated from the input files. Okay, so the first step here, again, is to inspect the input files to understand the logic that we are dealing with, and then open the Workflows tab and click on the plus button to open the Workflow Designer session. So inside this Workflow Designer, we are initiated, the Workflow Designer sessions are initiated with an empty workflow, right? It only contains a single sub workflow with no units, with no workflow units inside it. So the first step is to set up the naming for the workflow. I call it new workflow from pw.x input. I name the first sub workflow SCF and SCF. And then I proceed to add a unit to this first sub workflow. Then I look through all the parameters, make sure that they correspond to what I want them to be. So the Quantum Espresso is the application that I'm dealing with. The version of it is also as I desire. And then I go to the unit section and click on plus unit and click apply. So now we have this pw.SCF template unit added to the sub workflow. If I click on it, I can edit the unit information. So here we have specific information for this unit. We see that it corresponds to Quantum Espresso. It has certain executable and flavor, right? And there are multiple flavors that we can deal with. You see there is SCF and SCF bands, relax, VC relax, and so on. And these flavors will define the template for the input file. So for SCF, we'll have an SCF as a calculation type. For NSCF, we'll have NSCF, and so on and so forth. So here, what I have to do now is I have to migrate the name tags that are not present inside the template, but are present inside the input file. So here I'm noting that there are three name tags, three parameters that are different. So I'm copying them and I'm putting them into the corresponding name list, right? Adjusting the formatting. And so I'm going through the control system and the electrons name list and making sure that the parameters correspond to the input file. Okay, so I'm copying the smearing, and then for the electrons, I'm copying and replacing the whole block, right? Now, you should notice I'm removing the ions and cell name list because these are not necessary for my workflow in this case. You can notice that the atomic species, the atomic positions, and cell parameters and key points as well, they are having the Trinity variables. And I'm not touching them because this information will be populated based on the material entity. So we have just created the material entity, and this information will be automatically populated based on this entity. Okay, so if I click on the template data here on the right, you can see that there is materials and workflow information within this template data. And if I click on the preview button on the preview tab at the top, I can see that this material information is in fact populated within the template using the template data. Excuse me. So the next step is to repeat the same procedure for the other units inside the workflow. So we are adding a second unit, pw.SCF. It is by default. We are changing it to pw.NSCF because that's what we're dealing with in the second unit of this workflow. You can note that the properties that we're extracting are also changing. Right? So we're changing the properties extracted from this workflow. We're changing the monitors, and we're changing the template here as well. So now I am migrating the context, the content of the input template, migrating the content of the input file to the template. So repeating the same procedure for all of the name lists. Okay, and I can see that the template now is ready. So I have the SCF and NSCF units inside the workflow that I've just created. The last step here is to save the resulting workflow. And I can do that first by adjusting the name and adding some metadata to it again, and then clicking on the save button in the header, right? So what happens then? I have this workflow as part of my workflows collection. It has the specified tags, and now it's ready for me to use. Okay, so that is how we can create a workflow from scratch using the Quantum Espresso input files. Now, this could look like a laborious procedure, but the plus of this procedure, following it at least once, is to it's this ability to be able to reuse this workflow. We only have to set it up once, and then for each material that we're working with, we can reuse this SCF and SCF workflow. So essentially, once we have created it, once we have debugged, and once we made it work, we can apply it to as many materials as we want. And then the second option is to copy, instead of starting with the empty workflow, we can copy a similar workflow from the workflows bank. We have the workflows bank collection that contains all unique workflows that have ever been created by our platform users. And we can navigate into the workflows bank page, which I'm demonstrating here. So we click on the left hand sidebar, I click on bank and then workflows. And we can search for a workflow that is of interest to us. For example, band structure in this case. We can select it and click copy. So now the item is copied to our account collection. We can come back to our account and see that it is indeed present there. So instead of starting from scratch, we can start with a similar workflow and see how we can adjust it according to our requirements. Okay. As more people joining the platform, it's likely that they have already been running similar calculations to the ones that you'll be running. And we suggest starting with the workflows bank for any new users. One important note here also is that we suggest using the bank workflows produced by the curators account, because those are curated by the platform administrators, by the exabyte team. I do not see any questions as of this point, so I'm going to continue and speak about jobs. So once we have created materials and workflows, we are now ready to run the calculations, run simulations with the materials and workflows. And again, it can be done in two ways. Either we can completely bypass the user interface and use the command line terminal. This topic was covered earlier in one of the prior webinars on the topic, so I'll omit it today. But you can watch the recordings and see how it can be done in more details. I will focus on working with our web interface and reusing the materials and workflow information that we just created inside the job. So the first two steps are to create a material and a workflow. And then the step 3 is to create a job and select the corresponding material and workflow within it. So what I'm doing here, I'm navigating to the jobs list and clicking the plus button again to create a job. And I'm shown a warning saying that we have to first navigate into the project, which is what I'm doing right now. I'm going to the projects, navigating to the default project, and then clicking the plus button there. Okay, so now I'm creating a job inside the default project of this account that I'm working with right now. So inside the job designer, I'm adjusting the job name to make sure I can come back to it and understand what's happening inside the job. And then I'm selecting the material that I've just created, and I'm selecting the workflow that we've just created. Okay, so now I have a job pre-initiated with a material and workflow. Now the step number 4 here is to inspect the workflow in the job and adjust the required parameters. Now, on purpose, we made it so that the modifications to the logic of the workflow are not possible within the job design. We did that on purpose to maintain the consistency of the data. Right? You can imagine if everybody is going to change the logic of the workflow, adjust it as well within the job without creating a new entity of the workflow, it would be really hard to track and understand what has been going on, because we would expect one calculation based on the workflow name, but users would have adjusted it to one. We can put a different one. So we prohibit the modification of the workflow within the job designer. You can go back to the workflow designer and change it there, and then reuse the adjusted workflow here. But what we allow is to modify some non-essential parameters. Right? So here, for example, I can see that this input file now has key point sampling, which is different from the original key point sampling inside my input file. So what I can do right now is to adjust the key points. So I make sure that I copy the original values, and then I go back to the important settings for this workflow. And I adjust the key grid dimensions. So it's 4 by 4 by 2, and then 8 by 8 by 6, which is what I'm putting into the form. Okay, so now inside the input templates, the key point values are also adjusted. And I'm saving the information about this inside the job name. The step number 5 is to set up the compute parameters. So here I have to navigate to the compute tab. And an important note here is that we limit the time, the maximum time for which this job can be run for. Because in order to limit and avoid overspending credits, the computational credits on this job, you can imagine that the calculations could run for a long time, and they can run, the accounts can run out of credits. And for that reason, we put the hard limit. So make sure to adjust this limit when you work with the compute setup if you need it to be longer than the default one, which is 1 hour. So here I can set up things like the number of computational nodes to run this on, and the number of cores. So here I'm using the ordinary regular queue, which is by default the recommendation from our team is to use the ordinary regular queue. And if you're dealing with cluster 001, we would recommend using 18 cores within this queue for most production runs. And I'm clicking my name here to receive notifications about this job when it is started, aborted, or ended. And then I'm proceeding to save it. Right, so I'm clicking on the save button in the header to save this job. So when the job is saved, it is shown in the pre-submission status, which is in this bright blue color. And it is now available in the list of jobs. So the next step for me is to select this job and click run. And then what happens is that the job is transitioning into the submitted status in dark blue. And after a little while, we can see that there is an expectation for this job to be started within 10 minutes. So if we proceed to wait, we can see that this job indeed is started within 2 minutes and 22 seconds. And right now it is running, so it's in the active status. What we can do is we can navigate into this actively running job by clicking its name. And we can track and monitor its progress. So if we could navigate into the pw.x unit, again, clicking on it, it's highlighted in orange, meaning that it is the currently active unit. We can see the output of this unit in real time. We can see the convergence chart also updated in real time. And when the unit is finished, it is changing color from orange to green in this case. And if there is an error, it will be shown in red. So this is the way for us to monitor the progress of the simulation. Now I'm looking at the second unit, and since it's a production run, it takes a little while for this job to run. So we can see after about 15 minutes or so, this job is finished, and both of the units are now turned green. Okay, so now after the job is finished, I can see the results. So if I navigate back to the top of the page, I can see now, in addition to the materials, workflow, and compute tabs, I have the results tab and the files tab. And those are self-explanatory. If we go to the results tab, we can see the results of the units inside this workflow. You can see the SCF and SCF sub-workflow, pw SCF unit, and the corresponding results like the Fermi energy, the atomic forces, the pressure for this unit, and so on. The results are extracted at the end of the calculation, and the files are also uploaded at the end of the job. So these are all files produced during this calculation. If you click on one of them, you can download it, or you can preview it in the browser as well. Okay, so that's how we can see the results and the files produced inside the job. And we can also see how much it costs by navigating back to the compute tab and clicking the cost. Here it will take us to the corresponding page where all our the corresponding charges for each of the jobs are shown. Okay, and the option number 8, which is, we're coming closer to the last part of this webinar, discussing the collaboration. So once we have run this job, and this is valid for both jobs originating on the command line and the jobs originating on the web interface, we can share them with another account. So here I have run a job under the webinar account, but I also want to access it from my personal account. So what I can do is I can click on the job and it's on the drop down at the end of the job entry here. And I can select share, select my name in the pop-up menu, and then click on read to grant myself read permissions for this job. You can see that now myself and the public have read permissions for this job. So the job is visible for the public, and it's also going to be visible under my account. And we can see there's a check mark now in the shared column, meaning that this job is directly shared with another account. Okay, so if I now navigate back to my account, I will be able to see this job. Okay, so now let's summarize the jobs section quickly. The command line jobs are a quick way to start with the platform, but they require users to modify, edit, and input files each time a job is created. And they only allow for storing the data on disk, so there's no connection to the database, and it's difficult to collaborate on command line input files. The user interface jobs originating on the user interface take some time to get used to, but when implemented properly with the flexible workflow and the unit template logic, we can deal with multiple materials at once. We can organize data in a database, and we can enable advanced collaboration features. So most people use a limited number of workflows. So once we go through those and we create the corresponding workflows in the user interface, we're done, right? We can apply those workflows to multiple materials, and it becomes a much simpler procedure after the initial heavy lifting. Okay, so now let's continue and speak about the sharing and collaboration. So once we have created materials and workflows and jobs, how can we collaborate? How can we share this information? First, we have to understand how the accounts work, like what accounts can I have access to as a platform user. To understand that, we need to open my accounts page, which is accessible from the right-hand sidebar. So I click on my name here in the top right corner and navigate to my accounts page to see the accounts that are available for me. So now I am a member of multiple accounts. That includes my personal account and 4 organizational accounts. So if I want to use the platform as a member of the webinar account, the seminar called seminar, I can click on its name. And as I see now, the top right corner changed accordingly. So now I'm not using the platform as Timur. I'm using the platform as a member of this seminar account. So all the entities that I'm creating, all the entities that I'm having access to right now have changed to correspond to the entities produced under this account, right? So we can see the account information. We can see all of its entities here. And if I go back to my account instead, so I'm navigating to my accounts again and clicking on my name, you can see that this information, the entities are different. So this is a way to work in your personal domain or in the domain of other organizational accounts that you have access to. For the organizational account, for the accounts that have team access, we have team-based, role-based permissions. So we can add users, add members to an account by navigating to the People tab and clicking a plus button there. Right, so now I'm selecting users by their usernames and click on Select Items in the top to add these users as members to this example organizational account. Now, the 4 people listed here, the 4 users are now members of this organizational account. One of them is an owner and an administrator. So this user has elevated permissions. The others are regular members. Now I can create a team inside this organizational account in order to grant certain permissions to this newly added users. So I'm creating a team by navigating to the Teams tab and clicking the plus button again. I'm calling this team Test Team. I'm giving it a quick description. This is just an example team. And I'm setting certain permissions for this team, like read and edit. Right, so this is a read-only team, so it only has the read permissions. Excuse me. Now, the next step is to add the current platform, organizational members to this team. So I'm navigating to the team, and then I'm adding the organization members to this team. So now these members will have read permissions on the items that are also accessible to this team, on the entities that are accessible to this team. So we have added the people. Now the next step is to add the entities to the team. So I'm adding materials from the account collection to this team. I can also do that with workflows, jobs, projects, and so on. So now the people that I have added to the read-only team will have read permission on the materials that I have added. So they will be able to see those materials. Now, there are certain ways to share the entities between accounts, as I mentioned, and there are multiple access levels available on the entities. These access levels include direct access, so when the entity is shared with another account directly. When the entity is shared with all other accounts in the platform, so shared publicly, but not accessible to non-registered users. Then we can also give access to anyone with a link, which is equivalent to the feature inside Google Docs, for example. And we can have access to anyone on the web. So if people would run a search for this entity, they would be able to see that on Google. So we have different access levels. And here I'm going to demonstrate how to set up these access levels for the entities. So initially we start with all the entities being private to my account, right? I'm not sharing them with anyone. And then I will share the first entity with the webinar account by selecting it and then clicking share option in the top menu. and then selecting the webinar and giving it the read permission. So now the entity that I have created here at the bottom will be available and visible to the webinar account. The second entity I'm sharing with the public, with all users. In a similar manner, I'm selecting it and then clicking read to give all platform users read permission. The third entity I'm sharing with anyone with a link in a similar way. And then the fourth entity I'm sharing with anyone on the web. Right, so now we can see how all these entities have different access levels enabled. And these different access levels also are seen in the jobs list. An equivalent procedure can be done for materials or workflows. This is just an example for jobs. Now, to be able to see the entities that are shared with my account, I can navigate to this shared with me dialog highlighted by number 1. And then to see the entities shared with everyone on the platform, I can navigate to the shared publicly page. And those look identical to my account page. Again, they have the entities summarized, so materials, properties, workflows, and jobs. And here I can see the workflow, the job that was shared with my account, with the webinar account by Timur. So I have shared the job as user Timur with the account called webinar. And if I navigate under the webinar account into shared with me, I will be able to see this job. Okay. Again, this is just a quick repetition. For materials. We can do an equivalent procedure. We can share a material with anyone with a link. And again, it's shown in an equivalent way in the materials list. If I navigate, open the left-hand sidebar and click on shared with me and go to the entity tabs, I will be able to see the jobs shared with me. That's how it looks. Right, just a quick video demonstrating this functionality. And if I go to left-hand sidebar, shared publicly, and go to the entity tabs, I will be able to see all the jobs produced by the platform users. Okay, shared publicly, navigating to the list of jobs. There is quite a number of them, so we might need to adjust the number of jobs per page to be able to see through the job sets and see the jobs. Okay, so a couple of notes about the sharing and collaboration notes. There is a way to add a quick description to the entities. For that, we're going to need to click on this information icon in the header, and we can add description to the job. So this is how it's going to look like. There's a dialog where we can use Markdown to put a quick summary for a job, a material, or a workflow. And this is what I'm demonstrating here with headers, subheaders, and links. And we can also add things like code blocks or source code. Okay, so this is how it's going to look like in the jobs list. We need to click on those 3 dots, enable the ID and description field, and the description will be shown here in plain text. So if you add description to the items, it will be easier for you to navigate the items and see which one corresponds to what inside the jobs list or materials list. Okay, and to finish our discussion, I have a quick note about the account entities and entity banks. I mentioned previously that we can copy workflows from the workflows bank, and materials and workflows are the bankable items, the items for which we maintain the entity banks. And entity banks contain unique entities. right? So when we create materials, specifically everybody has a default material enabled for their account, which is equivalent. We create FCC silicon as a default material for each newly created account. So instead of having 1,000 entities, right, which are the same, inside the materials bank, all of these 1,000 entities will correspond to one single entity, which is unique. And in the situation when multiple accounts create entities, these entities can be private when the private data option is enabled for this account. So when the materials bank entity corresponding to the account entity is created inside the bank, no other accounts can access it. And when the public data is selected instead, other accounts can see and work with the materials and workflows created by this account X. Okay, so let's summarize with our discussion about accounts and sharing. The entities can be shared within one account and only that account for a secure and safe collaboration. Account teams have different permission schemes, and these permission schemes allow account members to perform certain actions on the entities according to these permissions. Sharing between different accounts is possible, and we can set it up to be shared with all platform users and external non-registered parties as well, depending on the access levels. The entities support metadata, for example, tags or descriptions, to help users exchange information and to understand which entities correspond to what, to retain some additional information inside the entities. And last but not least, unique entities are consolidated inside entity banks for an easier access and to organize the information. Okay, I think that's it for today. That is all the content I had for you guys. Let's see if we have any questions. No questions so far. Anybody wants to speak out and raise a hand and ask a question live? Looks like no volunteers still. Okay, well, if nobody wants to ask questions, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. And this presentation will be shared as a PDF, and also we'll share the recording of this webinar. And next month, first Friday of next month, we'll continue this webinar session with getting started, so with more basic topics. With that, I'd like to thank everybody.